It was 10:18 on a Thursday night when headlights swept across the front windows of my cabin. Out here, nobody showed up by accident. The road ended half a mile back. If someone came this far, they meant to. I set down the screwdriver I'd been using and looked through the glass. A dark sedan sat near the gate with the engine running. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out and stood beside the car without moving. Not lost, not confused, just standing there as if she was trying to gather the last bit of strength she had left. The porch light caught her face when she finally walked up the steps. Claire. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. 3 soft knocks. Not hurried. Not hesitant. 3 knocks. The kind people make when they've already exhausted every other option. I opened the door. Cold air drifted between us. She looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Her hair was damp from the mist. Her shoulders were tight beneath a dark coat. But it was her eyes that stopped me. They looked like someone who had spent a long time carrying something alone. She swallowed once before speaking. I didn't know where else to go. There it was. The thing that should have answered everything. Instead, it raised a dozen more questions. Because Claire wasn't the kind of person who ran out of options. She was organized, thoughtful, the person other people called when their lives started falling apart. Yet somehow she was standing on my porch at 10 o'clock at night telling me she had nowhere else to turn. Come inside, I said. She nodded immediately, almost too quickly, like she'd been afraid I might say no. The strange part wasn't that she stepped inside. The strange part was the look of relief that crossed her face when she did. As if reaching my door mattered more than what happened after. I noticed it before anything else. The way her shoulders lowered. The way she finally exhaled. The way her eyes moved around the room and settled. People only relax like that when they arrive somewhere they already trust. That thought stayed with me long after I took her coat and pointed her toward the kitchen. While water heated for coffee, she sat quietly at the table. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The clock above the stove ticked louder than usual. Claire wrapped both hands around the mug when I placed it in front of her. She stared into the steam for several seconds before taking a sip. There was something familiar about the scene. Not because we'd done this before. We hadn't. But because she looked like someone who had been heading here for much longer than a single evening. And that didn't make sense. Claire belonged to a chapter of my life I'd closed. Or at least I thought I had. 2 years earlier, after my marriage ended, most of the people connected to that world had disappeared. No dramatic arguments. No angry phone calls. Life simply moved on. That was what people said. Life moves on. The truth is that some people move on. Others just learn how to carry the empty spaces with them. I'd gotten pretty good at that. Work during the day. Quiet evenings. Small routines. Predictable days. There was comfort in predictability. Then Claire showed up. You can stay here tonight, I said eventually. As long as you need to figure things out. She looked down at her coffee before smiling faintly. Not a happy smile. More like gratitude mixed with exhaustion. Thank you. Another silence followed. Comfortable enough to sit in. Uncomfortable enough to notice. My eyes drifted toward the small leather notebook resting beside her chair. I hadn't seen her bring it in. It looked worn. The edges were softened from years of use. A thin blue ribbon stuck out between the pages. Claire noticed me looking at it and moved it slightly closer to herself. Not hiding it, just protecting it. A small gesture, easy to miss. But I didn't. A few minutes later, she excused herself and stepped into the guest room. The house became quiet again. I cleaned 2 coffee mugs instead of 1 and stared out the kitchen window at the rain. That was when I saw it. Through the windshield of her car. A folded parking receipt sitting on the dashboard. The date was from 3 days earlier. 3 days. Whatever had brought her here hadn't started tonight. She'd been carrying it for days. Maybe longer. And for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, she had driven past countless exits, countless towns, countless places she could have stopped, and ended up at my door instead. Standing alone in the kitchen, listening to rain strike the roof, I realized the most important part of Claire's story wasn't what she was running from. It was why she had chosen me. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was worried about Claire. At least that was what I told myself. The truth sat somewhere closer to the center of my chest, in the place where old questions tended to collect. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself standing at the kitchen window again. The rain had stopped. Water still clung to the pine branches outside, catching the pale light from the porch. Everything looked still, quiet, the way life usually looked around here. Yet the house felt different. Not louder, not busier, just less empty. That realization bothered me more than it should have. I had spent 2 years learning how to live alone. There is a difference between being alone and being lonely. Most people do not understand that. They think loneliness comes from empty rooms. It does not. Loneliness comes from feeling invisible inside a room that should have known you best. My marriage taught me that. Looking back, I do not remember a specific day when things broke. Most things do not break all at once. They wear down quietly. A missed conversation. A forgotten promise. A look that lasts half a second too long somewhere else. Then one day you realize you have become background noise in your own life. I was good at practical things. Fixing problems. Showing up when needed. Remembering details. The things reliable men do. The problem is that reliability often becomes invisible. People notice excitement. They notice charm. They notice grand gestures. They rarely notice the person who quietly keeps everything from falling apart. I learned that lesson slowly. The hard way. Around 6:30 the next morning, I smelled coffee before I heard anything else. Real coffee. Fresh. I walked into the kitchen expecting an empty room and stopped. Claire stood near the stove wearing one of the oversized sweaters she had pulled from her bag. Steam curled upward from a coffee mug beside her. Sunlight filtered through the windows behind her, turning the edges of the room gold. She looked more rested than she had the night before, but not by much. The exhaustion was still there, just tucked away deeper. She glanced over her shoulder. "I hope you do not mind." I looked at the coffee pot. "You found it." A small smile touched her face. "You keep it in the same place you always did." The words landed softly, almost casually, yet something about them stayed with me. I could not remember ever making coffee around Claire. Not once. She handed me a mug before returning to the counter. There was toast cooling on a plate. 2 slices. Exactly how I liked it. Lightly browned. Not burnt. Not pale. Just right. Another small detail. Another thing that should not have mattered. But it did. "You remembered that too?" I asked. Claire looked down for a second before answering. "Some things are easy to remember." Then she changed the subject. Not abruptly. Not suspiciously. Just enough to steer the conversation somewhere safer. We spent the next half hour talking about ordinary things. The weather. Road construction. A diner that had changed ownership a few towns over. Normal topics. Comfortable topics. Yet beneath every sentence sat the same unanswered question. Why here? Why me? Later that morning, while I worked in the shed repairing a broken cedar bench for a neighbor, I caught myself looking toward the cabin more than once. That annoyed me, mostly because I knew exactly why I was doing it. Around noon, Claire stepped outside carrying 2 bottles of water. She handed me one without saying much. Then she sat on the porch steps while I worked. No phone in her hand. No distractions. Just sitting there watching sunlight move through the trees. Every now and then we talked. Nothing important. Nothing dramatic. Yet there was an ease to it that felt strangely familiar. As if we had skipped several conversations somewhere along the way. At one point she nodded toward the bench. "You always take your time with details." That is another way of saying I work slowly. "No," she said. "It means you care about getting things right." The comment should not have affected me. But it did. Because it reminded me of something I had not realized I missed. Being understood without having to explain yourself first. That evening, after dinner, Claire carried her empty plate to the sink before I could stop her. The movement was automatic. Comfortable. Familiar. Like she already knew where things belonged. I watched her for a second longer than necessary. Then I noticed the leather notebook again. The same one from the night before. It sat near the end of the table. Worn edges. Blue ribbon. Years of use hidden between its covers. Claire followed my gaze and immediately reached for it. Not defensive, not nervous, just protective. The same way someone might protect an old photograph or a memory. Something important lived inside that notebook. I was suddenly sure of it. And for the first time since she arrived, I began to wonder if the answers I was looking for had been traveling with her the entire time. That night the notebook stayed on my mind longer than I wanted to admit. Not because I believed it contained some dramatic secret. Life was rarely that theatrical. But because of the way Claire protected it. People reveal a lot through the things they guard. Some people protect money. Some protect reputation. Some protect old wounds. The next morning arrived cool and clear. The kind of mountain morning that smelled faintly of pine needles warming in the sun. I woke earlier than usual and found the kitchen empty. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside the sink. Claire's tea. She preferred tea when she was thinking. I remembered that suddenly, and I could not remember why I remembered it. The realization lingered with me while I stepped outside. The world felt washed clean after the rain. Dew covered the grass. Somewhere deeper in the trees a woodpecker tapped steadily against a trunk. Ordinary sounds. Steady sounds. The kind that reminded you life kept moving whether you paid attention or not. Claire appeared a few minutes later carrying her mug. She sat on the porch railing and watched the sunlight filter through the branches. Neither of us spoke right away. It was becoming a pattern, not an awkward silence. A comfortable one. The sort of silence people only find after they stop trying to impress each other. Eventually she said, "You still come out here every morning." I looked over. "How would you know that?" The question slipped out before I thought about it. Claire smiled into her tea. "Lucky guess. Maybe, but it did not feel like one." Later that afternoon, we drove into town for groceries. Her car remained parked beside the cabin, untouched since she arrived. Another detail I noticed. Another detail that did not quite fit. If someone planned to leave soon, they usually talked about leaving. Claire never did. She moved through each day as if she had reached a destination she had not expected to find. At the grocery store, she seemed distracted. Not nervous. Not afraid. Distracted. Every now and then her attention drifted somewhere far away. Once I caught her staring through the front window toward the parking lot. "Everything okay?" I asked. She immediately nodded. Too quickly. Just thinking. People say that when they do not want to explain what they are really feeling. I knew because I had said the same thing for 2 years. We finished shopping and headed back toward the cabin. Halfway there, she rolled down the window. Cool air rushed inside. Her eyes closed for a second. Not dramatically, just long enough to appreciate the moment. "I forgot what quiet sounded like," she said softly. Something about the sentence stayed with me, because it sounded less like an observation and more like a confession. That evening she cooked dinner while I repaired a loose cabinet hinge. The smell of garlic and rosemary drifted through the house. Another ordinary moment. Another moment that somehow felt important. Claire moved comfortably around the kitchen. Not like a guest. Not quite like someone who belonged there either. Something in between. The space between arriving and staying. The space between strangers and something else. During dinner, she finally told me part of the truth. Not all of it. Just enough to let me see the edges. She explained that things had become complicated where she had been living. Too many expectations. Too much pressure. Too many people telling her what she should do next. She spoke calmly, carefully, like someone stepping around broken glass in the dark. Everything she said sounded true, yet the story still felt incomplete. Not false. Incomplete. There is a difference. One comes from dishonesty. The other comes from pain. When she finished, I simply nodded. I did not push for more. People talk when they are ready. Pushing only teaches them to become quieter. Claire seemed grateful for that. I could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed, in the way she looked at me afterward. Not with excitement, not with affection, with trust. A different thing entirely. Later that night I found myself alone in the living room while she showered. Her notebook sat on the coffee table. For the first time since she arrived, she had forgotten it. I stared at it for several seconds. Long enough to know I should look away. Long enough to know I would never open it. Some lines matter, even when nobody is watching. I reached for the television remote instead. As I did, The notebook shifted slightly. A folded piece of paper slipped free and landed on the floor. Instinctively, I picked it up. I was not trying to read it. I only meant to place it back where it belonged. Then I saw my own name written across the top in familiar handwriting. Ethan. Just my name. Nothing else. I froze. The paper remained folded. I never opened it. But standing there with my name written across something Claire had carried for who knew how long, one thought settled heavily into my mind. Whatever had brought her to my cabin had started long before the night she knocked on my door. The next morning, I returned the folded paper to exactly where I had found it. I never mentioned it. Some things belong to the person carrying them. If Claire wanted me to know what was inside that notebook, she would tell me when she was ready. Until then, curiosity was not a good enough reason to cross a line. Still, the image of my name written across that paper stayed with me. It followed me through breakfast, through the chores waiting outside, through every quiet moment that usually passed without much thought. Claire seemed lighter that morning. Not completely. The worry was still there if you looked closely enough. But it no longer sat on her shoulders the way it had the night she arrived. She had traded one of her sweaters for a flannel shirt she found at the back of the guest room closet. It hung slightly loose on her frame. When I pointed out that it used to belong to me, she looked down at the sleeves and laughed softly. That explains why it feels like a blanket. The sound surprised me, not because she laughed, because it had been days since I had heard it. Real laughter has a way of changing a room. The cabin felt warmer afterward. Around mid-morning, I headed outside to stack firewood before the weather turned again. Claire appeared a few minutes later carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to me and sat on a log near the woodpile. We spent nearly an hour talking while I worked. Nothing important, at least not on the surface. We talked about old diners that disappeared after highways changed, about the smell of bookstores, about how some songs instantly return you to a specific year of your life. Small conversations, the kind people often forget. Yet those conversations are usually where trust begins, not in grand confessions. In ordinary moments repeated enough times to become meaningful. At one point, I set down an armful of firewood and noticed Claire watching me with a thoughtful expression. "What?" I asked. She shook her head. "Nothing." That was definitely not a nothing face. Another small laugh escaped her. "I was just thinking. About." She hesitated. "You still do that?" "Do what?" "Take care of things before they become problems." The comment lingered between us. Not because it was dramatic, because it was accurate. I had spent most of my adult life doing exactly that. Fixing things, preparing for things, making sure other people had what they needed before they asked for it. Most of the time nobody noticed. Claire did. That realization settled somewhere unexpectedly deep. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up supplies from the hardware store. When I came back, the cabin looked different. Not dramatically different, just cared for. The porch had been swept. The flower box near the railing had fresh soil. The kitchen counters were organized. Even the throw blanket on the couch had been folded neatly instead of being left where I usually dropped it. Claire sat at the table reading when I walked in. "You did all this?" I asked. She looked around as if she had not noticed. "I was bored." "You reorganized half the cabin because you were bored?" A faint smile appeared. "Maybe." The strange thing was that none of the changes felt intrusive. They felt thoughtful, as if she had paid attention to how I lived before deciding what to touch and what to leave alone. That evening rain returned. Nothing heavy, just a steady rhythm against the roof. We ate dinner at the kitchen table while a small lamp cast warm light across the room. At some point the conversation drifted toward favorite books. Claire mentioned one I had not thought about in years. A novel I used to keep on a shelf in my old house. Before the divorce. Before everything changed. "You remember that?" I asked. "Of course." She looked surprised by the question. "You talked about it all the time." I frowned. "I do not remember talking about it." "You did." She smiled into her coffee. "Nobody else listened. But you talked about it." The words landed. Quietly. Nobody else listened. There was no accusation in her voice. No bitterness. Just an observation. Yet something about it stayed with me. because it explained a lot more than she probably realized. As the evening stretched on, the rain grew heavier outside. Claire eventually gathered her tea and headed toward the guest room. Halfway down the hallway, she stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not asking questions before I am ready to answer them." Then she disappeared into the room and closed the door softly behind her. I remained at the table long after, listening to rain strike the windows, thinking about everything she had not said, thinking about all the things she somehow knew about me. The books, the coffee, the routines, the habits, the details nobody usually noticed. And for the first time, a different question began to form. Not what was she hiding, not even why she came here. I found myself wondering how long she had been paying attention. The question followed me through the next few days. Not in a dramatic way. It simply stayed there, quietly occupying space in the back of my mind. How long had Claire been paying attention? The answer seemed to reveal itself one small detail at a time. On Monday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found my travel mug sitting beside the coffee pot. Clean, dry, ready to use. That might not sound remarkable, except I had left it in the truck the previous evening. I remembered because I had been too tired to go back outside for it. "You went out there for that?" I asked. Claire looked up from the newspaper spread across the table. "For what?" "The mug." She shrugged as if it were obvious. "You use it every morning." Then she returned to reading. No explanation. No attempt to make the gesture seem important. That was the thing about Claire. The details never felt performative. They felt natural, as though noticing people was simply part of who she was. Later that afternoon, I spent several hours repairing a section of fencing near the property line. The work was repetitive. Measure, cut, hammer, repeat. Around noon, Claire appeared carrying a small cooler. "Lunch break," she announced. I laughed. "You make it sound mandatory." "It is mandatory." She set the cooler down and handed me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Turkey, Swiss cheese, a little mustard. Exactly the way I liked it. I stared at it for a second. "Let me guess." "Lucky guess." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe." We sat beneath the shade of a pine tree while the breeze moved through the branches overhead. The air smelled faintly of warm grass and sawdust. For a while, neither of us spoke. It was strange how comfortable that had become. Two people sitting together without feeling responsible for filling every silence. Eventually, Claire glanced toward the fence. "You always finish things you start." I laughed softly. "You make me sound more disciplined than I actually am." "No," she said. "Just dependable." The word settled somewhere deep. Dependable. Years ago, I would not have thought much about it. Back then, I probably would have mistaken it for an ordinary compliment. Now I understood the difference. Some compliments focus on what a person has. Others focus on who a person is. Dependable belonged in the second category. That evening, we stopped by a small bookstore in town after dinner. It occupied the corner of an old brick building near the courthouse. The owner knew me well enough to wave from behind the counter. Claire wandered through the shelves while I browsed the history section. 20 minutes later, she appeared beside me holding a novel. "You never finished this one." I looked at the cover and blinked. "How do you know that?" "You told me." "When?" She thought for a second. "Years ago." I stared at her. "You remember that conversation?" "Of course." She looked genuinely surprised by the question. "You were frustrated because everybody else liked the ending and you thought it was predictable." I laughed despite myself. The memory returned immediately. Not because I remembered telling her. Because she had repeated the exact opinion I held. Word for word. It was the kind of detail most people would forget within a week. Claire remembered it years later. On the drive home, I found myself watching the passing trees through the windshield and thinking about all the conversations I had as soon disappeared into the background noise of life. Apparently, some of them had stayed with her. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because everyone wants to be remembered. Unsettling because I had no idea why she remembered so much. A few nights later, we sat on the porch watching a summer storm gather beyond the hills. Lightning flashed somewhere in the distance, too far away to hear. Claire rested a blanket across her lap, even though the evening was warm. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." After everything that happened, she paused. "Did you ever think about leaving?" "Leaving where?" "All of it." I understood what she meant. The town, the memories, the life that came before. I leaned back in my chair. "For a while." "What stopped you?" The answer arrived before I could think about it. "This place still felt like mine." Claire nodded slowly, as if she understood more than I had actually said. Maybe she did. We sat quietly after that, watching the clouds roll across the darkening sky, listening to the first drops of rain strike the porch roof. Then Claire spoke again, almost too softly to hear. "Some people make places feel like home." I turned toward her. She was staring out at the trees, not looking at me, not waiting for a response, just speaking a thought aloud. A few minutes later, she stood and carried her mug inside. I remained on the porch alone, rain tapping steadily overhead, her words lingering in the air long after she left. Some people make places feel like home. The next morning, I found the leather notebook resting on the kitchen table, closed, unattended. Beside it sat a folded grocery receipt covered in handwritten notes. At first, I thought it was a shopping list. Then I recognized my own handwriting copied carefully between several lines. Dates, book titles, favorite foods, small details collected over years. I stared at the page for several seconds before hearing footsteps behind me. When I turned around, Claire stopped in the doorway. For the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely caught off guard. For a second, neither of us moved. Claire stood in the doorway while I remained beside the table holding the receipt. The morning sunlight spilled across the floor between us. Dust drifted lazily through the light. Somewhere outside, a truck passed on the county road. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments. Yet the room suddenly felt very small. Not because of what I had found, because of what it suggested. Claire looked at the paper, then at me. A faint flush appeared in her cheeks. "I can explain that," she said quietly. I set the receipt back down exactly where I found it. "You do not have to." She studied me for a moment. "Most people would have questions." I almost laughed. Most people probably would have opened the notebook too. That earned the smallest smile. Not a happy smile. More like relief. The kind people feel when something they feared finally happens and turns out less frightening than expected. Claire walked over and sat across from me. The receipt remained between us. "I never meant for you to see that." I figured. She looked down at her hands. "Some of those notes are old." "How old?" Her eyes lifted briefly. "Years." The answer should have felt strange. Instead, it felt oddly consistent with everything else. The coffee, the books, the sandwich, the conversations she remembered better than I did. None of it appeared accidental anymore. Claire folded the receipt carefully and slipped it back into the notebook. "I notice things," she said. "That is all." I nodded slowly. "You notice a lot." A silence settled over the table. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Eventually, Claire stood and carried her tea mug to the sink. The conversation could have ended there. Maybe it should have. But something shifted after that morning. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. The following week brought a stretch of unusually warm weather. The kind of late summer days that made the mountains look painted against the horizon. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee, breakfast, small conversations before work. Yet somewhere along the way those routines stopped feeling temporary. Claire no longer looked like someone waiting to leave. She looked like someone finally catching her breath. One Tuesday afternoon, I was replacing boards on the back deck when my phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored calls like that. Something made me answer anyway. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time I hung up, I was staring out at the trees. "Everything okay?" Claire asked from the porch. I slipped the phone into my pocket. "Just a paperwork issue." It was not entirely a lie. An insurance problem connected to an old property matter. Nothing catastrophic. Just frustrating. The kind of thing that creates 3 hours of work to solve a problem that should take 10 minutes. Claire watched me for another second. "You are doing that thing." "What thing?" "Pretending something does not bother you because you think it is easier than talking about it." I blinked. "I do that. All the time." I laughed despite myself. "That sounds made up." "It is not." There was warmth in her voice, not criticism, familiarity. That evening, after dinner, I sat at the kitchen table sorting through forms and documents. The pile seemed to grow larger every time I looked away. Around 8 o'clock, Claire appeared carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one beside me and pulled out the chair across from mine. "You do not have to help." "I know." She picked up the first stack anyway. For the next hour, we worked through paperwork together. Reading forms, checking dates, organizing records. Simple things. Yet every time I looked up, she was still there. Not because she had to be, because she chose to be. That realization stayed with me long after we finished. A few days later, the insurance company called again. This time while I was in town picking up supplies. By the end of the conversation, I was standing alone beside my truck, feeling more irritated than I wanted to admit. Before I could think about it, my phone was already in my hand. My thumb hovered over the contact list. Then I stopped, because there was only one person I wanted to call: Claire. The thought surprised me. More than that, it unsettled me. For 2 years I handled everything alone. Good news, bad news, frustrations, decisions. That was simply how life worked now. Yet somehow Claire had become the person my mind reached for first. Later that evening, as if proving the feeling ran both directions, her phone rang while we were cleaning up after dinner. I watched her expression change as she listened. Concern, uncertainty, worry. When the call ended, she remained still for several seconds. "Everything okay?" I asked. Claire looked directly at me, not toward her phone, not toward the window, at me. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I do not really know what to do. And in that moment, I realized something important. When life became difficult, Claire no longer searched for answers by herself. She came to me first. Claire remained at the kitchen table long after asking the question. The coffee in her mug had gone cold. The dishes from dinner were still drying beside the sink. Outside, darkness had settled across the trees, turning the windows into mirrors. For a while, neither of us spoke. Not because the silence felt uncomfortable, because some conversations need room before they can move forward. Eventually, she folded her hands together and stared down at them. "I received a call from someone I used to work with," she said. "They want me to come back." I nodded slowly. "That sounds like good news." "It should." The answer came too quickly. She looked toward the window. "Everyone keeps telling me it is good news." I leaned back in my chair. "But," Claire laughed softly. There was no humor in it, just recognition. "But I do not feel relieved." The words lingered between us. I understood them better than she probably realized. There were moments in life when the thing you once wanted finally appeared, only to discover you were no longer the same person who wanted it. Claire spent the next several minutes explaining. Not every detail, just enough. The opportunity would solve practical problems. It would put her life back on a predictable path. It would satisfy expectations. Yet every time she imagined accepting it, something felt wrong. "I know how that sounds," she said. "No, you do not." She looked up. "I do not." "No," I smiled faintly. "Because I understand exactly what you mean." Her expression softened. "You do?" I nodded. Sometimes the safest choice and the right choice are not the same thing. For a moment, she simply stared at me. Not because what I said was profound. It was not. It was just honest. Then she looked down and smiled to herself. The kind of smile people wear when somebody finally says the thing they have been trying to explain for weeks. After that conversation, something shifted again. Small enough that neither of us acknowledged it. Significant enough that both of us felt it. The next few days passed quietly. Morning coffee, work around the property, evening conversations. The familiar rhythm we had somehow created together. Yet beneath it all sat a new awareness. Claire no longer felt like a guest. The realization arrived one afternoon while I was returning from town. As I drove up the gravel road, I saw her sitting on the porch steps reading a book. One foot tucked beneath her. A glass of iced tea beside her chair. Sunlight filtering through the trees behind her. She looked comfortable. Not temporary. Comfortable. And for reasons I could not explain, seeing her there filled me with a sense of relief I had stopped expecting from life. Later that evening, we cooked dinner together. Or rather, Claire cooked while I followed instructions poorly. At one point she laughed and took the knife from my hand. You build fences better than you chop vegetables. That seems like a very specific skill comparison, and somehow still accurate. Her laughter echoed through the kitchen. I found myself smiling before I realized it. The strange thing was that moments like that had become normal. A month earlier, I would have spent the evening alone. Now I caught myself looking forward to them. Looking forward to her. That realization should have worried me. Maybe part of me did worry. Because wanting people creates risk. The more important someone becomes, the more power they gain to leave an empty space behind. I learned that lesson once already. The memory arrived unexpectedly while I was locking the front door before bed. The old instinct. The old caution. The quiet voice reminding me that people do not always stay. I stood there for a second longer than necessary. Then I glanced toward the guest room hallway. A light still glowed beneath Claire's door. Somehow that made the house feel steadier. The next morning began like every other. Coffee, breakfast, a list of chores waiting outside. Except Claire seemed distracted. Not anxious. Not frightened. Thoughtful. She checked her phone more than once. Stared out the window longer than usual. Around noon, she finally set the device face down on the counter. Everything okay? I asked. She hesitated. I might need to leave soon. The words landed softly, yet they hit harder than they should have. I kept my expression neutral. Years of practice made that easy. Because of the job? She nodded. Partly. A pause followed. I cannot stay here forever. No, she could not. We both knew that. The arrangement had always been temporary. Rationally, nothing had changed. Emotionally, everything had. The rest of the afternoon passed normally. At least on the surface. We repaired a loose porch railing. Talked about nothing important. Shared dinner. Watched the sunset fade beyond the trees. Yet beneath every ordinary moment sat the same realization. Time was suddenly limited. That night, I sat alone on the porch after Claire went inside. Crickets chirped somewhere in the darkness. A cool breeze moved through the pines. The cabin looked exactly the same as it had for years. Yet the thought of it without Claire no longer felt the same. I tried to imagine waking up to an empty guest room. No coffee waiting in the kitchen. No conversations across the table. No quiet presence moving through the house. The image settled heavily in my chest. That was when I finally admitted something to myself. The fear was not that Claire might leave. The fear was how much I would miss her when she did. And as if the universe had decided that realization alone was not enough, headlights suddenly appeared at the end of the driveway. A vehicle I had never seen before slowly rolled toward the cabin. The vehicle stopped beside the cabin just after 10 o'clock. Its headlights washed across the porch before going dark. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 50s. Gray hair. Expensive jacket. The kind of person who spent most of his life in offices instead of outdoors. I recognized him immediately from a photograph Claire had once shown me years ago at a holiday gathering. Her former supervisor. Richard Lawson. The man walked toward the porch with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. I stood and met him near the steps. Ethan, he asked. That is right. He glanced toward the cabin windows. I am here to speak with Claire. There was no hostility in his voice. No threat. Just certainty. The certainty of someone who believed the situation already had an obvious solution. Before I could answer, the front door opened behind me. Claire stepped onto the porch. The moment she saw Richard, something changed in her expression. Not fear. Not anger. Something closer to exhaustion. Like a person seeing a chapter they had worked very hard to close. Richard offered a small smile. Claire. She folded her arms. How did you find me? You left more clues than you realized. He looked around. You have been difficult to reach. Claire did not respond. The silence stretched. Richard sighed. Everyone is worried about you. Everyone, she asked softly. Or everyone who wants something from me. The question landed harder than any argument could have. Richard looked away briefly before returning his attention to her. You built a remarkable career. People invested in you. Opportunities like this do not come around twice. Claire remained quiet. I stood slightly off to the side, listening. Not because I wanted to involve myself. Because I was beginning to understand what she had been running from. Not a person. Not a place. Expectations. Obligations. A version of herself that no longer fit. Richard spent the next several minutes outlining the opportunity waiting for her. Better position. Better compensation. Better future. On paper it sounded impressive. Yet with every sentence he spoke, Claire seemed to withdraw further into herself. Finally she interrupted. You still do not understand. Richard frowned. Then explain it to me. Another silence. This one longer. More difficult. Claire looked out toward the dark tree line. For years I kept choosing the life everyone expected me to want. Richard opened his mouth, but she continued before he could respond. Every promotion. Every move. Every decision. Her voice remained calm. I kept telling myself I would feel different once I reached the next goal. The porch grew quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. And now? Richard asked. Claire smiled sadly. Now I finally understand that success and happiness are not the same thing. Richard did not have an answer for that. Eventually, he handed her a business card. The offer is still available. She accepted it politely. Thank you. A few minutes later, he returned to his vehicle and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the distance. Neither Claire nor I spoke immediately. We stood on the porch watching darkness settle back into place. Finally, she sat down on the top step. I joined her. For a while, we simply listened to the night. Crickets, wind, the familiar sounds of the mountains. I am sorry you had to see that, she said eventually. You do not have to apologize. Claire looked down at her hands. Everyone keeps acting like the answer is obvious. And it is not. She shook her head. No, I waited. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, she laughed softly. Do you know what scares me the most? What? I should want that life back. She stared into the darkness beyond the porch. Everything about it makes sense. Yet every time I think about returning, it feels like walking away from something important. My chest tightened. Unexpectedly. Not because of what she said. Because I already knew what she meant. Some truths arrive long before anyone speaks them aloud. Claire looked toward me. Her eyes reflected the porch light. Tired eyes. Honest eyes. When I came here, I told myself it was temporary. I said nothing. She continued. Then every morning I would wake up and feel calmer than I had in years. Her voice grew quieter. Every day felt simpler. Clearer. She smiled faintly. And the worst part is that you probably have no idea why. I looked at her for a long moment. The answer sat somewhere between us. Close enough to feel. Not close enough to touch. Maybe not, I said. Claire laughed softly. Then she stood and disappeared inside the cabin. I remained on the porch long after she left, looking at the empty driveway, thinking about everything she had said, thinking about everything she had not. And for the first time since she arrived, I became certain of something. Claire had not come here because she lacked options. She had come here because, for reasons I still did not fully understand, this was the place she wanted to be most. The next morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only exists after a decision has finally begun forming, even if nobody has spoken it aloud yet. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor. Coffee filled the air. Somewhere outside, wind moved gently through the pines. Claire stood by the window holding a mug in both hands. She looked rested, more rested than I had seen her since the night she arrived. Not because her problems had disappeared, because something inside her had stopped running. I noticed it immediately. People carry tension differently. Some in their shoulders, some in their voice, some in the way they enter a room. Claire no longer looked like someone bracing for impact. She looked like someone learning how to stay still. We spent most of the day working around the property. Ordinary tasks, small repairs, cleaning out the shed, organizing tools that should have been organized months ago. Nothing important. Yet every moment seemed to carry a weight neither of us acknowledged. Around mid-afternoon, I found Claire sitting on the porch steps with her notebook resting on her lap. The same notebook, the one that had followed her everywhere. For several minutes, she simply stared at it. Then she looked up. Do you have a minute? I sat beside her. She opened the notebook slowly. Pages filled with handwriting, notes, dates, fragments of conversations, memories preserved in ink. Claire turned several pages before stopping. I think it is time you understand something. I stayed quiet. She handed the notebook to me. The first page contained a date from years earlier. Beneath it was a simple sentence. Ethan spent 20 minutes helping a stranger find a lost dog and never mentioned it to anyone afterward. I turned the page. Another note. Ethan stayed late after everyone left because he knew someone had to finish cleaning up. Another page. Ethan always notices when people feel uncomfortable and changes the conversation so they do not feel alone. Page after page. Small moments. Tiny details. Things I barely remembered myself. None of them impressive. None of them extraordinary. Just ordinary acts of kindness scattered across years. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Claire, she shook her head gently. Keep going. So I did. There were dozens of entries. Maybe hundreds. Conversations. Observations. Memories. The things people usually forget. The things I assumed nobody noticed. Yet Claire had noticed all of them. Preserved them. Remembered them. When I finally looked up, she was watching me quietly. Why? The word came out softer than I intended. Claire smiled. Not sadly. Not nervously. Just honestly. Because they mattered. I stared at the notebook resting in my hands. Most of these things are nothing. That is where you are wrong. Her voice remained calm. They were never nothing. The wind moved gently through the trees around us. Somewhere a bird called from deep in the woods. Neither of us looked away. Do you know what I realized after all these years? She asked. I shook my head. The things people admire first are rarely the things they trust most. She glanced toward the mountains. People notice confidence, success, charm. Then she looked back at me. But the things that make you feel safe are different. I felt my chest tighten again. Not from surprise. From recognition. Claire laughed softly. I spent years watching everyone overlook the same things. Her eyes met mine. The things that mattered most. Silence settled between us. Not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that arrives when a truth finally reaches the surface. The night I came here, she continued, I told myself I just needed somewhere to think. I listened. That was not entirely true. She looked down briefly before continuing. I could have gone anywhere. There it was. The question that had followed me since the beginning. Why me? Why here? Claire took a slow breath. I came because every time my life felt complicated, every time I felt lost, every time I needed to remember what actually mattered, I found myself thinking about the same person. My pulse quickened, not because of romance, because of the weight behind her words. Years of weight, years of certainty. You were always the person who made people feel safe, she said, even when nobody thanked you for it, even when nobody noticed. I looked away toward the trees, suddenly unable to hold her gaze. 2 years of loneliness. 2 years of believing I had somehow been insufficient. 2 years of carrying the quiet belief that maybe I had simply been easy to leave behind. Claire reached over and gently closed the notebook. You keep seeing yourself through the eyes of people who failed to understand your value. The words landed directly in the center of every wound I thought had healed. That is not fair, I said quietly. Maybe not. She smiled. But it is true. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. We sat together watching sunlight shift across the porch, watching shadows lengthen through the trees. The world felt strangely peaceful, as if something that had been searching for its place finally found it. Eventually Claire stood. I called Richard this morning. I looked up. You did? She nodded. I turned down the offer. My heart skipped once. Are you sure? Claire smiled. The answer appeared in her eyes before she spoke it. For the first time in a very long time. Evening arrived slowly. We cooked dinner together, laughed more than usual, talked about ordinary things. Yet everything felt different. Not because we had changed, because the truth was no longer hidden between us. Later that night, we sat on the porch beneath a sky full of stars. The mountains stretched dark against the horizon. The cabin glowed softly behind us. Home. The word appeared in my mind unexpectedly. Not the building. Not the land. The feeling. Claire rested her hands around a warm mug and looked out toward the trees. I spent years looking for the right place, she said quietly. Turns out I was really looking for the right person. I smiled before I could stop myself. She smiled too. No dramatic declarations. No grand gestures. Just two people who finally stopped pretending they did not already know. And sitting there beneath the stars, surrounded by the quiet life I once thought was too small to matter, I realized something I should have understood long ago. The things I believed nobody noticed were the exact reason someone chose me. Not because she needed saving. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Because after seeing every version of my life, every flaw, every ordinary detail, she still believed I was where she belonged. For the first time in years, the future did not feel uncertain. It felt warm. It felt steady. It felt earned. And most of all, it felt like home.